Samuel Burke had spent a lifetime striving to be the cornerstone of stability for his blended family. A successful small business owner, he worked tirelessly to ensure that his stepdaughter, Elise, and his wife, Maria, never wanted for anything. It wasn't just financial security he offered. Samuel prided himself on being a father figure Elise could trust and a husband Maria could lean on. But trust, like glass, is fragile. And Samuel was about to discover just how easily it could shatter. The day had started innocuously enough. Samuel had risen early, pouring his coffee in the pre-dawn quiet of their quaint Connecticut home. Maria was still asleep, her form curled protectively beneath the soft covers. He cherished these silent mornings, moments where he could sip his brew and feel a small measure of peace before the demands of life intruded. Today, however, was different. Samuel had been preparing to have an important conversation with Elise about her future. At 22, she was weeks away from graduating college, and Samuel had promised her he would help pay off her student loans. It was a promise he made without hesitation, even though Maria often reminded him that Elise wasn't his biological daughter. To Samuel, it didn't matter. Elise was family, and family took care of each other. But something gnawed at him as he drove to meet Elise at the local cafe. She had sounded distracted when he called to arrange their meeting, brushing off his questions with vague reassurances. Just some final stress, she had said, her tone clipped. The cafe was bustling, filled with students hunched over laptops and locals chatting over pastries. Samuel spotted Elise immediately. Her auburn hair, pulled into a loose ponytail, glinted in the sunlight streaming through the windows. But her demeanor was off. She fidgeted with her cup, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Elise," Samuel greeted, pulling out a chair across from her. "You okay?" She looked up sharply, her green eyes wide with something he couldn't quite place. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. "Just, tired." Samuel nodded, letting the silence stretch as he studied her. "I thought we could go over your loan documents today. I've been talking to the bank, and I think we can consolidate everything into a manageable plan." The color drained from Elise's face. "Oh," she said, her voice faltering. "That's nice of you. But, you don't have to do that." Samuel frowned. "Elise, this isn't about obligation. It's about making sure you start your adult life on solid ground." "I appreciate it," she murmured, her gaze dropping to her coffee. "But, it's complicated." Complicated. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Before Samuel could press her further, Elise's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her expression flickering with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "I should go," she said abruptly, grabbing her bag. "Thanks for the coffee." Elise, wait, but she was already out the door, leaving Samuel with more questions than answers. That evening, as Samuel recounted the odd encounter to Maria, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply amiss. Maria was dismissive, waving off his concerns as typical college stress. But Samuel knew better. Elise was hiding something. And if there was one thing he couldn't abide, it was secrets. Driven by an uneasy curiosity, Samuel decided to dig deeper. He started by reviewing Elise's finances, expecting to find little more than typical college expenses. Instead, he uncovered something far more alarming, a series of large cash withdrawals spanning months. The sums were too substantial to ignore, and they painted a picture Samuel couldn't make sense of. Determined to get to the truth, Samuel contacted Elise's bank under the guise of needing statements for her loan consolidation. What he discovered left him reeling. Elise wasn't just paying off loans, she was funneling money into a private account tied to Maria's name. The realization hit him like a freight train. What could Elise and Maria possibly be doing that required such secrecy? And why would Maria, the woman he'd loved and trusted for over a decade, involve Elise in it? The answer, Samuel feared, would unravel everything he thought he knew about his family. Samuel's discovery gnawed at him throughout the night, turning his rest into a series of fragmented dreams and dark imaginings. He had always been a practical man, someone who believed in confronting problems head-on. Yet, as dawn broke, painting their bedroom in soft hues of orange, he found himself paralyzed by uncertainty. Maria stirred beside him, her arm draping lazily across his chest. Her touch, once comforting, now felt laden with questions. Was she aware that he knew? Or was her sleep the innocent repose of someone with nothing to hide? Slipping out of bed quietly, Samuel made his way downstairs. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen as he stared blankly out the window at the backyard garden. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their delicate petals a cruel contrast to the storm raging within him. His mind raced through possibilities. Was this about money? A hidden debt? Or something far worse? His phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Elisa's university, a reminder about her upcoming graduation ceremony. A wave of pride swept through him, momentarily replacing his unease. He had been there for Elise since she was a preteen, stepping into a role her biological father had failed to fulfill. To Samuel, she wasn't just a stepdaughter, she was family. But now, that bond felt strained, tainted by unanswered questions. Samuel picked up the phone and dialed Elise. She answered on the third ring, her voice clipped and cautious. "Elise, I need you to come home for dinner tonight," he said, trying to sound casual. "It's been too long since we've had a proper family meal." There was a pause, long enough for Samuel to feel the weight of her hesitation. "Sure," she said finally. "What time?" 7. "Bring your appetite." By the time evening arrived, Samuel and Maria worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing Elisa's favorite dishes. Their movements were synchronized from years of familiarity, but there was a tension in the air that neither could ignore. Samuel studied Maria out of the corner of his eye. She hummed softly to herself, a habit she had when trying to mask unease. Did she know what he had uncovered? Or was her calm demeanor genuine? Elise arrived on time, her posture stiff, her eyes darting between her mother and Samuel as though gauging the mood. Dinner was a stilted affair, the conversation skimming the surface of ordinary topics: school, Maria's garden, Samuel's plans for the business. But beneath the polite exchanges, Samuel could feel the tension humming like a taut wire. When dessert was served, Samuel leaned back in his chair and let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "So, I was going through some paperwork for your student loans," he said, his voice steady. Elise froze, her fork hovering midair. Maria's hand tightened on her wine glass. "I noticed something odd," Samuel continued. "Large cash withdrawals, almost like you're paying someone. Care to explain?" Elise glanced at Maria, her face paling. Her mother's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. "It's nothing," Elise said quickly, her voice trembling. "Just, some things I needed to take care of." "Elise, I'm not asking to scold you," Samuel said, leaning forward. "But I deserve to know what's going on." Before Elise could respond, Maria spoke, her tone sharp. "Samuel, can we talk about this later? This isn't the time." Samuel turned to her, his voice cold. "When, then? After more of my money disappears without explanation." Maria flinched but held her ground. "You don't understand. It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," he snapped, his voice rising. Elise pushed back her chair and stood abruptly, tears brimming in her eyes. "Stop it. Both of you," she cried. "It's not Mom's fault. It's mine." Her words silenced the room. Maria's face crumpled, and she shook her head vehemently. "Elise, no," she whispered. "You don't have to." But Elise seemed to have reached her breaking point. Her voice was raw as she confessed, "I've been helping Mom hide things." "From you?" "From him." Samuel's breath caught. "Him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you talking about?" Elise looked down at her trembling hands. "Mom's pregnant. And it's not yours." The world seemed to tilt beneath Samuel's feet. For a moment, he couldn't comprehend the words. Pregnant? Not his? The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. Who? His voice was hoarse, filled with restrained fury. Who's the father? Elisa's silence was answer enough. Samuel turned to Maria, who had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "It's someone she's been seeing," Elise said, her voice breaking. "For a while. And now, they're planning to be together." Samuel's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. "Planning?" he said, his tone dangerously low. To be together. You knew this whole time. Elise nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. She didn't want to hurt you. She thought, if you didn't know, you wouldn't get dragged into it. And yet here I am, Samuel said bitterly. He turned back to Maria, who still couldn't meet his gaze. You involved Elise in this? Made her your accomplice? Maria's lips quivered, but she said nothing. The silence in the room stretched until it became unbearable. Samuel grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door. I need air. Outside, the night was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos in his heart. He leaned against the porch railing, staring into the dark expanse of their yard. The life he thought he knew, the family he thought he could depend on, it all felt like a fragile illusion. But Samuel wasn't a man who gave up easily. He would uncover the full truth, no matter how painful it might be. Only then would he decide how to pick up the pieces, or whether to leave them shattered. Samuel spent the night sitting in his truck parked on a desolate stretch of road just outside town, staring into the dark abyss of the surrounding woods. The weight of Elisa's confession and Maria's betrayal bore down on him like a leaden cloak, suffocating and inescapable. His mind churned with memories, questions, and a growing fury that gnawed at the edges of his composure. He replayed Maria's sobs and Elisa's tearful admissions, searching for answers in their words but finding only more questions. Who was the man Maria had chosen over their family? How long had she been lying to him? And what had driven Elise, his steadfast stepdaughter, into becoming her accomplice? Samuel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. He needed clarity, and he knew where to start. By dawn, Samuel had made his decision. Driving back into town, he parked in front of a quiet diner and ordered a black coffee. The waitress barely looked up as she placed the steaming mug in front of him. Taking a sip, Samuel pulled out his phone and began scrolling through Elisa's social media profiles. He wasn't well versed in the digital world, but desperation gave him focus. Pictures of Elise with her friends, study group selfies, and graduation announcements filled her feed, mundane, ordinary, and utterly unhelpful. Then he found it, a tag in an older post. It was from Maria's yoga instructor, someone named Jack. The caption was innocuous, a group shot of students after a class, but Samuel's gut churned as he stared at the image. Jack, a tall man with an easy smile, stood close to Maria, his hand resting casually on her shoulder. Samuel saved the image, his mind racing. Could this be him? The father of Maria's child? The man who had quietly dismantled his life. He returned home to find the house eerily quiet. Maria's car was gone, and Elisa's bedroom door was closed. Samuel hesitated for a moment before heading into his office and pulling out a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were old receipts, notes, and documents, things he had held onto when he first started his business. Among them was an old digital recorder he had used during meetings. It was basic, but functional. He placed it in his pocket and waited. Maria returned that afternoon, her face pale and drawn. She avoided Samuel's gaze as she walked into the kitchen and began unloading groceries. Samuel watched her in silence, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. You should have told me, he said finally, his voice low but steady. Maria froze, her hand hovering over a carton of milk. Slowly, she turned to face him, tears already brimming in her eyes. I didn't want to hurt you, she whispered. I didn't know how to. You didn't know how to stop lying. Samuel interrupted, his voice rising. How long, Maria? How long have you been seeing him? Maria's shoulders sagged, and she leaned against the counter as if the weight of her secrets had finally become too much. Over a year, she admitted. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant for it to go this far. Samuel's laugh was bitter, hollow. Never meant for it. You dragged Elise into this, made her lie to me. That wasn't a mistake, that was calculated. Maria flinched, but before she could respond, Elise appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. I'm sorry, she said softly. For everything. Samuel turned to her, his voice gentler but no less firm. Why, Elise? Why didn't you come to me? Tears welled up in her eyes. Because I love her. She's my mom, and I thought I was protecting her. I didn't know what else to do. The sincerity in her voice cut through Samuel's anger, replacing it with a deep, aching sadness. He had always believed in family above all else, but now that belief felt like a double-edged sword, binding him to people who had betrayed him. Samuel didn't respond. Instead, he walked past them, his mind already on his next move. That evening, Samuel drove to the yoga studio listed on the photo he had found. The studio was closed, but a small sign on the door listed a phone number for the instructor, Jack. Samuel dialed the number, his hands trembling slightly. It rang twice before a smooth voice answered. Jack speaking. Samuel's grip on the phone tightened. This is Samuel Burke. I think you know my wife, Maria. There was a pause, followed by an audible intake of breath. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, Samuel snapped. I know everything. Meet me tomorrow, 10 a.m., at the coffee shop on Main Street. We're going to talk. Without waiting for a response, Samuel hung up. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat in his truck, the quiet night pressing in around him. The following morning, Samuel arrived early, choosing a table in the corner where he could see the entrance. Jack arrived minutes later, looking every bit as Samuel had expected, athletic build, confident posture, and a face that seemed unbothered by the damage he had caused. Jack hesitated when he saw Samuel but eventually approached the table. You wanted to talk, he said, his tone guarded. Samuel stared at him for a long moment before speaking. I don't care about your excuses. I want to know what your plans are with my wife and the child you've put inside her. Jack blinked, taken aback by the bluntness. Look, Samuel, I'm sorry this happened. I never meant to. Spare me the apologies, Samuel cut him off. Are you planning to marry her? Raise the child? Or is this just some fling to you? Jack shifted uncomfortably. I care about Maria. But this is complicated. Not for me, it isn't, Samuel said coldly. You have two options, step up or step out. But if you step out, you'll answer to me. Jack's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I'll talk to Maria. We'll figure this out. Samuel stood, his expression grim. You'd better. Because if you leave this mess for me to clean up, you'll regret it. As he walked out of the cafe, Samuel felt a strange sense of calm. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, he would reclaim control of his life, no matter the cost. The days following Samuel's confrontation with Jack were heavy with tension. At home, Maria avoided Samuel as much as she could, and Elise tiptoed around the house as if any wrong move might set off an explosion. Samuel, for his part, maintained an icy calm, speaking only when necessary and spending most of his time at work or in the garage, tinkering with tools he didn't need to fix. By midweek, Maria finally broke the silence. Late one night, after Elise had gone to bed, she knocked softly on the door to Samuel's office. He looked up from his desk, where he had been staring at the same ledger for an hour. Can we talk? Maria's voice was tentative, trembling slightly. Samuel gestured for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I spoke to Jack, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. And? Samuel's tone was sharp, but not unkind. He said he needs time to think. He's scared, Samuel. This wasn't something either of us planned. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. You've had over a year to think about this. And you've put me in the position of cleaning up your mess. Time isn't something I'm willing to give anymore. Maria flinched but nodded. I understand. And I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, but I need to tell you why this happened. Samuel's lips tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I was lonely, she admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. You were so focused on work, on providing for us, and I felt invisible. Jack made me feel seen, alive. It doesn't excuse what I did, but that's the truth. Samuel's jaw clenched, his mind churning with a mix of anger and pain. So your solution to feeling invisible was to betray the man who gave everything for you? Maria's tears spilled over. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to fix what was broken between us. Samuel stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You didn't even try, Maria. You made a choice to step outside this family instead of facing your problems head-on. And now Elise is caught in the middle of this disaster. Maria sobbed into her hands, but Samuel felt no satisfaction in her pain. Instead, he turned and left the room, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his chest. The next morning, Samuel decided he needed clarity. He drove to a lawyer's office on the edge of town, a place he had passed 100 times but never thought he would need. The receptionist greeted him warmly, and within minutes, he was sitting across from a man named Henry Blackwood, a no-nonsense attorney with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. After Samuel laid out the situation, Henry leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "This is a complicated situation," he said. "But there are steps you can take to protect yourself." Samuel listened intently as Henry explained his options. Divorce was on the table, of course, but so was renegotiating financial agreements to ensure Maria's betrayal didn't leave him in ruins. Henry also recommended drafting a letter to formally establish that Samuel would not take legal responsibility for the child Maria was carrying, a move that would protect him from future obligations. It was cold, clinical, and exactly what Samuel needed to hear. By the time he left the office, he felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him for days. That evening, Samuel called Elise into the living room. Maria lingered in the kitchen, her presence a shadow in the corner of his vision. "I need to know the whole truth," Samuel said, looking directly at Elise. "No more half-answers, no more secrets. If you want me to forgive you, and I want to, Elise, you have to tell me everything." Elise hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. Finally, she spoke. "Mom told me about Jack a few months after it started. She said it was just a fling, that it would end soon, but, then she found out she was pregnant." Samuel's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "And the money?" Elise nodded, her face flushing with shame. "It was for things she couldn't let you see, doctor's appointments, things for the baby. She was scared you'd find out." "And the wedding?" Samuel pressed, his tone sharper. Elisa's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "What? Don't lie to me, Elise. I heard you. You and Maria are planning a future with him." "No." Elisa's voice cracked. "That's not what it is. Mom talked about leaving, but I swear, I don't know if she meant it. I told her I wouldn't help with that." Samuel exhaled slowly, his anger giving way to exhaustion. "I love you, Elise. But I can't keep looking at you and wondering if you're telling me the truth. Do you understand that?" Elise nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." Maria stepped into the room then, her face pale and drawn. "Samuel," she began, her voice shaking. "I need you to know something." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" "I don't know what Jack will decide, but I've made my choice. I want to stay. I want to fix this, if you'll let me." Her words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Samuel looked at her, at the woman he had loved and trusted for so many years, and saw a stranger. Could he forgive her? Could he rebuild what had been so thoroughly shattered? "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice hollow. Maria nodded, her face etched with regret. As she turned away, Samuel stared out the window into the darkening sky, wondering if forgiveness was something he could truly give, or if some betrayals were simply too great to overcome. Samuel sat alone in his truck, parked on the same lonely stretch of road where he'd first sought clarity after the betrayal. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the darkened trees. In the days since Maria's confession, life in the Burke household had become a fragile balancing act, each family member tiptoeing around the others, trying to avoid the shards of their shattered trust. But Samuel was done tiptoeing. Tonight, he would bring everything to a close. He had spent the past week methodically putting his affairs in order. With the help of Henry Blackwood, he had quietly shifted the ownership of his business to a trust, ensuring its future was untouchable. He'd also filed the necessary paperwork to legally disassociate himself from Maria's unborn child. His heart ached at the cold finality of those decisions, but they were necessary. He couldn't continue living in a house built on lies. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Samuel drove home, his resolve firm. When he walked through the door, the house was dark and silent. Elisa's bedroom door was closed, and Maria sat alone in the living room, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the television. She looked up as Samuel entered, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. Maria muted the television and gestured for him to sit. He remained standing, towering over her as he spoke. "I've made my decision," Samuel said, his tone devoid of the warmth she once knew. "I can't stay in this marriage." Maria's face crumpled, tears spilling over her cheeks. "Samuel, please. Don't," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "I've heard all the apologies, the excuses. But none of that changes what you did. You made your choices, Maria, and now I'm making mine." "I'll do anything," Maria pleaded, standing to face him. "Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us." Samuel shook his head, his expression resolute. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our family, and you dragged Elise into it. That's something I can't forgive." Maria collapsed onto the couch, her sobs filling the room. Samuel felt a pang of sorrow but pushed it aside. His mind was made up, and he wouldn't waver. The next morning, Samuel packed his belongings. He moved methodically, his heart heavy but his determination unwavering. Elise watched from the doorway, her eyes red and swollen. "Where will you go?" she asked softly. "I've rented an apartment in town," Samuel replied, not meeting her gaze. "I'll still be here for you, Elise. That hasn't changed." She nodded, her tears falling silently. "I'm sorry, Dad. For everything." Samuel paused, his chest tightening at her words. He stepped forward and wrapped her in a tight hug. "I know you are," he said. "And I'll always love you." By afternoon, Samuel's truck was loaded, and he stood on the porch of the home he had built with Maria. She emerged from the house, her face pale and drawn. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll wait for you, Samuel. However long it takes." Samuel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Don't wait for me, Maria. Move on. That's the best thing you can do." With that, he climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving behind the house that had once been his sanctuary. Months passed, and Samuel slowly began to rebuild his life. He poured himself into his work, finding solace in the routine of running his business. Elise graduated college and visited him often, their bond slowly healing. As for Maria, Samuel heard through mutual acquaintances that she had given birth to a baby boy and was living alone. Jack, it seemed, had chosen to walk away. One evening, Samuel sat on the balcony of his small apartment, watching the sun set over the town. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but it had dulled with time, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He had learned that life, though often cruel, offered opportunities for redemption and renewal. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Samuel raised a glass to the future, a future unburdened by lies and betrayal, a future that was finally his own. What would you have done in Samuel's place? Could forgiveness ever be an option, or are some betrayals too deep? Share your thoughts below.